So, we got one more parable to read together. And the third parable, the reason I did that is the first two parables are kind of a setup. They're both exactly the same parable for two different people. They're somebody loses something, and then they go find it. And one of the things that is really important is the assumption in the parable that if you lose something, that implies that it used to be with you, right? I wouldn't say, I lost
your yacht.
My yacht. Yes, thank you. I wouldn't say I lost my yacht because I never had a yacht. You could only lose things that you had, right? And so that's really, really important as an underlying part because the way our faith is construed and taught, sometimes we don't see ourselves, I think, quite the way we ought to. And I think that this set of parables, especially the third parable here, the one we're going to read, the parable they call the Prodigal Son, I think that teaches us something about God that really shifts our whole way of looking at life. And it shifts the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And the stories we tell about ourselves are the things that really guide our life. They guide our thinking, they guide our joy, they are what drive our lives. That's what comes out of our hearts, is our own personal stories. And Proverbs says, guard your heart, because it's the wellspring of life. So what I want to do today is look for our personal story in these stories. So this is the parable of the prodigal son. It follows the other two immediately. Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me my share of the property that's coming to me. And he divided his property between his kids. Not many days later, the younger son gathered everything he had and took a journey into a far country, where he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the people in that country, who sent him out into his field to feed pigs. And he was longing to feed himself the pods that the pigs were eating, but nobody would give him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But here I am, perishing in hunger. This is what I'll do. I'll stand up and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. So that son got up and rose and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quickly bring the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. And kill the fatted calf and cook it, and let's have a feast and celebrate. Because my son who was dead is alive again, who was lost and is found. And so everybody began to celebrate. Now, his older brother was out in the field. And he came in and got near the house, and he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants over and asked them what that was about. And the servant said to them, your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fat calf, because he received him back safe and sound. But the older brother was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, I've served you these many years, and I never disobeyed one of your commands, and yet you never even gave me a young goat that I could celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, comes home, and you kill the fatted calf for him. And the father said to his son, Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. So I want to look at all 3 characters, and we're going to see if we can find our story in here. And we're going to start with the person that I think is probably the most reasonable person in here, the most normal person in here. And I think it's the older son. I think he has the most natural reactions. I think he's the one that acts like normal people might act. The first thing he does is he's angry and he refuses to go in. And I think that seems pretty normal. I think for a number of reasons. One reason is that nobody came and got him. Put yourself in his place. He's out there being the diligent son, out there working in the field. The other son comes home. They start throwing a party, and nobody thinks to send someone out to get him and tell him his brother is home and we're having a party. How would you feel? I think I would feel excluded. I think my nose would be a little out of joint. Or a lot out of joint, depending on what kind of mood I'm in and how I ate and slept that day. They couldn't even care enough to go tell him. And then he says something that kind of tells us a little bit about him. Although I don't know if it tells us too much, because people say things when they're mad that they don't necessarily think in normal times. Anybody ever said something when you're mad that you're like, maybe that wasn't exactly the right way to say that? Yeah. So he says, all these years I've served you, and you never even gave me a scrawny little goat, and now you're killing the fatted calf. And you can imagine, and I think what he says here is even kind of reasonable. Because this guy messes up his life, he squanders his father's wealth, and now he gets a party. And I think of people like, they go out and they live horrible lives, and they do horrible things. Maybe they spend some time in prison for doing something awful, and they get out of prison, and then they get a book deal with a $100,000 advance, and they go on a speaking tour. They're like, well, geez, I should have done that instead of just been like a faithful little pastor of a church. Could have gone a lot farther if I would have done something bad. So I think that his reaction is not entirely unreasonable. Like, if that's how you get parties in our family, that's what I'm going to do. And that happens, and we think like that. And he's really mad because he doesn't even say, my brother. He says, this son of yours. When you can't say somebody's name, that's a clue that you're really mad at them. So, and then evidently the younger brother has a reputation already, because the older brother says he devoured your property with prostitutes, and you must assume that or know that or whatever. So maybe you might be able to identify with the older son, and you're like the person who's dutiful, right? You're the firstborn, or in my case, you're the secondborn, where the firstborn was a rebel. Normally the firstborn is the dutiful one, the dutiful child, but if the firstborn turns into a rebel, then the second one steps into that place and becomes the dutiful one. So maybe you are the first son. And that's, holy cow, that thing must get overhooked. So maybe you're the first son, and maybe you just feel like you spent your life being very dutiful and measured and honest and trustworthy, and then something happens and you begin to feel, why did they get that when I'm the faithful one? And I think that's a real human emotion. So he's the only real normal one, though. The other two are really kind of off the wall. So the second one I want to talk about is the younger son, the prodigal. By the way, prodigal, I had to look it up a while ago now, but I still had to look it up because I always thought that meant going away, right? Lost. And it doesn't mean that. Prodigal comes from the same root as prodigious, like a lot. A prodigal is someone who spends freely. So this is the son who wastes money. That's who he is. And so first of all, the whole setup for this parable is the son goes to the dad and says, give me my inheritance now. Okay, parents with children. How would that make you feel? Anybody okay with that? Yeah. No, it's like saying, I wish you were dead, but you're not, so can I still have my inheritance now? Because I'm kind of done with this family, I don't want to be part of this, and I don't really want to be under your thumb anymore. So this is really a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. It's unbelievable. And in this environment, in this culture, to disrespect your father like that, I mean, we can kind of, in the culture of reality TV, where people have to do things that are like that to get people's attention, it's not as shocking as it would be in this sort of village kind of atmosphere where everything is on respect for the elderly and stuff. And so this is utterly rude. And what Jesus sets this up as is everybody hates this kid. Okay? Everybody's like, oh, I hate him. That's the setup of the whole thing. The whole crowd hates the kid and wonders what's going to happen to the kid that they hate. So the dad says yes, and he gets his money, and he goes off and he lives it in reckless living, blowing his money on prostitutes and things. And then a famine arises because life isn't always stable and bad things happen. And this Jewish boy gets it. And right now the crowd is probably smiling because he says that kid ended up feeding pigs. And you know about Jews and pigs. And Jews don't eat pigs. They don't touch pigs, let alone serve pigs food, right? I mean, that's like you are serving a pig. That's about as low as it goes for a Jew. And in the book of Proverbs has a lot about wisdom in it. And one of the things it says is that there are people who won't follow wisdom, and wisdom turns around and mocks them when they fall. Wisdom mocks them when they fall. And so when Jesus says, so this guy had the audacity to ask for his inheritance, and he went off and he blew it, and he ended up feeding pigs. And everyone's like, yeah. And finally, the bad guy gets it. That's the way it's supposed to be. But then, in the story, of course, he comes to himself. He hits bottom, and many of us have hit different kind of bottoms in our life, where we kind of come to the end of ourselves, and one way or another, we realize that we aren't who we thought we were, or we aren't able to do what we thought we could, all that kind of stuff. And so he rehearses an apology. And he says, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I am not worthy to be called your son anymore. Not worthy to be called your son. And he rehearsed an apology. Have you ever rehearsed an apology? I think most of us probably in our lives have done something big enough that we have thought ahead of time, how am I going to apologize for this? And we rehearsed it. And in case you need, I'm not even going to go through the list, but Peacemaker Ministries has a great formula for formulating a great apology. It's the 7 A's of a great apology, and it's in your sermon handout. But you can look at that later, not now. I should have told you at the end. So he formulates an apology, comes home, he's sorry, he comes home, and he gets a party. And everything's awesome. Everything is awesome. And maybe you're the younger son. Maybe you are on your way down. Maybe you feel like things are spiraling out of control. Maybe you are or have recently hit bottom. Or maybe you've already been there and through that, and you feel like you've re-encountered the living Christ, and you're at the party. And that's cool. And that's a really good place to be, right? To be at the party. So that's the younger son who is rude and selfish. The older son, as Matthew pointed out before the service today, he turns out to be pretty selfish too. But the parable isn't really about either of those sons any more than the other two parables are about coins and sheep. They're all about the looker. They're all about the father figure. They're all about the God figure. The way God is. That's what these parables are about. The way God is. So let's look at the father. Because father is the one who really seems crazy almost. And we're going to get to know the father. We're going to understand who he is through his interactions with his two sons. So first, his younger son. His younger son comes to him and says something so offensive. I'm just thinking of this right now. In that culture, I think, and maybe even now, almost, it's like, if your son came to you and said, I would like my inheritance now, you know what I would say? There you go. That's all you get. If you ask a question like that, right? Yeah, you can have your inheritance. It's a goose egg, you selfish little boy. Get out. I think that would be an unreasonable thing. But the father grants his request. And this is when the people listening to the story are like, That's when they really sit up and take notice. Because you got a character you hate, that's fine. But then the father says, okay, now this is a really strange story. And we need to listen to it to figure out, because Jesus is trying to teach us something. Because it's not a normal story. The father actually says, okay. And what this means is a third of the father's estate. Typically, the inheritance rules at that time, the younger son would get a double portion, and then all the other sons would get a single. So if you got two sons, the estate gets divided up into thirds, and then the older son gets 2/3, and the younger son gets 1/3. If there's 3 sons, the estate gets divided up into fourths, and then the older son gets 2 pieces, and the younger sons all get 1 piece, and on down that way. So this is a third of this man's estate. This is not that kind of $20. And he gives it to him. And that's crazy. That's crazy. So that teaches us something about God. And I think it starts by teaching us God is, I'm not going to say the word crazy, but from our perspective, it might seem like God's crazy. From our perspective, it might seem like God's crazy. But the next time we see the father, while the son was still a long way off, he's walking, his father sees him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. So there's a lot we learn there about the father, a lot to notice. While the son was a long way off, that means 2 things. One, that means he's keeping an eye out for him, because he's a long way off and he notices him. And the second thing is he has not forgotten his son, because he can recognize him from a distance. I don't know if you ever noticed, but people are amazing at pattern recognition. And that's what they've been building, like ID computers to kind of emulate. Is that if you have somebody that you know well, and you dress a crowd of people all the same, and you tell them all to walk, everybody walks a little bit different, and you don't even know you picked up on this pattern. But I bet you can identify your kids' walk. I bet if I put 10 kids up there dressed exactly the same and said, okay, walk, and I put wigs on all of them, you could still kind of tell. You would have a good shot at picking out your kids just by their gait, just by the way they swing their arms and move their shoulders and all that stuff. And so he notices, he can tell from a distance that this is his son. He's still intimately aware of his son. His eyes are out, and he feels compassion. His heart goes out to his son, and then he does something else that elderly people never do, especially the patriarch of a family never does. He runs. He throws caution to the wind. He throws decorum. He ignores all sense of decorum. And the patriarch runs out in compassion and emotion to embrace his son. And he kisses him, and he reinstates him completely on the spot. That's what the robe and the ring and the shoes are about. The robe is a symbol of being part of the family. The ring is what you sign with. You know, if you have signing authority, you drip wax, or in their case also clay. You would imprint in soft clay with a ring. The ring is getting the family signature stamp. Slaves go barefoot. Family members wear shoes. He embraces him before he even gets back. He embraces him and reinstates him fully. And this is where we're learning more about God, and that's going to be something that's going to help us learn more about our own story as well. And then he kills the fattened calf, and the son says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And the father says, my son has come home. So the son has this story he's telling himself about his unworthiness, and the father puts a different story on him and says, you are my son. So then, the older man, this is a very extraordinary father, because the older son has got his nose out of joint and won't come in. And the father leaves the party where he's the host, and he goes to entreat. And that means to plead earnestly, even anxiously with somebody. He pleads anxiously with the older son. And what he says to the older son teaches us a lot too. The first thing he says is my son. So he calls him my son. This is one of the biggest points in the whole thing, is the father continues to call both kids my son. The second thing he says is really important. You are always with me. He recognizes the son's faithfulness. And then he says, everything I have is yours. So that's really important, because what he's saying is, your brother has blown his inheritance, and he's really blown his inheritance. It's not, I'm not going to be re-splitting this again, right? That's an important little point, is the earthly consequences of his unwise behavior remain. He blew his inheritance, so he has blown his inheritance. I'm not taking it away from you. Everything I have is yours, because now he's the only heir, right? So that's a big deal. You're always with me. All that is mine is yours. And then he says, it's fitting to celebrate and be glad, because your brother, see, the son says, this son of yours, and the dad redirects him back and says, no, your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. So, where do we go with this? What do we take home from this amazing parable? First of all, it is that the younger son didn't get a second inheritance. Wisdom mocks people who don't listen. This is not in any way an encouragement for an unwise lifestyle. The prodigal son is not, you can do whatever you want and everything will be fine. That's not what it teaches, because the younger son blew his inheritance and it remained blown. He didn't have it. He didn't live wise, and he has the earthly consequences. Everything belongs to the older son now. But what I really want to get at is the narrative. The older son and the younger son. Both of them seem to have a transactional view of their relationship with their dad. The younger son says, I'm not worthy, I blew it, so now I don't get to be your son. The older son says, I've worked and I've worked, I've earned your son. I've earned your sonship. And they're both thinking in terms of how what they've done governs their relationship with their father. And that's the real point of this parable, is that what they have done does not govern their relationship with their father. The relationship with the father is not transactional. It is a relationship of love. And that's really the point here. And we go through and the earth is transactional. There's no way around it. It's economic, it's all that. And so we're programmed to think that way. And so we go around and we have this transactional view of the faith that sometimes infects our brain. Have I done enough? Have I prayed enough? Have I read my Bible enough? Do I believe hard enough or strong enough, or whatever kind of word you want to use? Or have I done things that are so bad that I really don't belong in church anymore? Either one of those is transactional. It's like give and take. And this parable stashes the transactional view of faith altogether. Because the seekers continue to seek in the corn and the sheep. And here we have this father who refuses to let the son's behavior define the relationship. Now it defines the consequences in the earthly sense, but it doesn't define the relationship. You are my son. The younger son comes back saying, I'm not worthy, and the dad says, you are my son. The relationship hasn't changed. The older son, he says, you're always with me. You are my son. So the question is, what story do you tell yourself about yourself? And what story do you need to hear today? Maybe you're the younger son and you feel like you're not worthy. Maybe that's the way that transactionalism infests your faith. You just walk around with this sense of unworthiness. And fair enough, you are, whatever, you've blown it, big deal, we've all blown it, but that's the entirely wrong model. It's the wrong framework for the whole thing. You are God's son. Or maybe you're the older son and you feel like you're earning it and you're worthy. And when you feel like you're trying to earn your faith, you are still left insecure, because you never know if you have done quite enough, if you have prayed quite often enough, if your church attendance has been regular enough, if whatever enough you are seeking has been there. And so either way, that transactional view of faith will kill the righteousness, peace, and joy that God has called us into. And the Father tells these people who they are. You are my son. You are my son. So that's my question to you, is what story do you tell yourself? Do you tell yourself the younger brother story about not being worthy? Do you tell yourself the older brother story that you're pretty good and you could be worthy if you just tried a little more? Because either way, it's the wrong story. The story is, you are my son. You are my son. That's what we all need to hear today, is the story, you are my son. And that changes the way we tell other people about Jesus too. Because we don't have to tell other people, if this is the way you like it, you can tell it, you're a sinner in need of a Savior. But you, I think, more powerfully, you can tell people they are God's children. And He loves you. And then you can say, someone will say, well, how can you love me because of what I did, or blah, blah, blah. And you can say, well, let's look at the parable we just read. The message today for you is, you are God's son. You are God's daughter. You just are. You just are. And all the transactional thinking is to be left behind. That's how to function in the world, fine, but it doesn't define your relationship. You are God's son. And that's why these parables are named wrong, is because they are about the looker's relationship with the thing. The first one, it's a woman who wants to go find the coin. It's a shepherd who wants to go find the sheep. And it's a father who wants his children back. It's a father who wants his children back. And that's what it's really about. God wants you to know you are his child. Period. Whatever's weighing down on you, whatever's bothering you, whatever insecurities you have, leave them at the altar today for me taking with you. And just be God's child. Just be. Father in heaven, you have given us this parable of the crazy father as a picture of who you are. And he comes and each of his sons has a story they tell them about themselves. They tell themselves about themselves. And those stories are transactional and worthiness based, whether or not it's unworthy or worthy. And in this parable, you shatter that. And you show us that our relationship with you is not transactional. It is simply the love of a Father. Help us to hear that and live that. In Jesus' name. So we'll continue with communion in 5 minutes. And there's some questions. These are in your bulletin too. Something to think about while we listen to some music. You can think about, when have I been like the older son or the younger son? What seems to trigger those kind of transactional feelings, whether it's self-righteousness or unworthiness? When have I not treated others as the father treats his son? Because that's what I call. And then how do I need to tell myself a different story about who I am? Or a different story about who other people are? And I